Hey, I'm Chris Willard, and I am the Director of Generosity Development for Leadership Network, which means that I've had an opportunity to work with a ton of really great churches who are trying to figure out what does it take to create a culture of generosity and stewardship and giving in your church. And over the years, as we've worked with these churches, we've learned a ton about what it really takes to get that done in your church. One of the things that we've identified with many of these churches is that they are realizing that giving and generosity has to be thought of in the church as part of the fundamental spiritual journey that you want the people in your church to be on. It's not just something that you keep siloed, it's not something that you just try to get them to do, but you think about cultivating generosity in your people as part of their discipleship process. One of the churches that we worked with early in our Generous Churches leadership community was Crossroads Church in Cincinnati, and I was so proud of that team led by Brian Tome because of the way that they identified the challenge and the problems that so many people have in their congregation related to money. They created a 6-week sermon series entitled Consumed, and Pastor Brian talked often about how money and stuff and a desire for things can consume us when what God really wanted to do was provide us with resources so that we could be a blessing to others. It's churches like Crossroads and others that have really figured out how to think about generosity in that fundamentally spiritual way that have really seen some great things happen. We, as we always do at Leadership Network, we like to measure results because we want to see what's happening as we're working with churches. And a couple of the key things that we've measured over the years it relates to giving. So you might not know this, but the average church in America, the average attender of a church in America only gives about 3% of their pre-tax income to any kind of charitable organization, including their church. Now that may feel on the one hand like a little bit of a disappointment, but another way of thinking about that though is that there's a real upside to that, because that means that a church that does a great job of casting vision and telling their story and really inviting people to give can see that giving increase significantly. So that's one of the metrics that we've measured. Another important metric that we want you to know about is that the typical megachurch gives about 14% of its revenue to ministries and organizations outside of the church, which I think is a great metric and a great idea, because what it does is it sort of contradicts that myth that the typical megachurch is really just about trying to gather stuff and gather people and keep all the dough and keep all the resources for the church. A few trends as it relates to this whole idea of generosity and creating a culture of generosity in the church might be worth talking about. Let me give you 3 trends that we are seeing as we work with these churches. One is that we're seeing that generous churches are teaching differently about money than they have in the past. It used to be, well, some of us perhaps grew up in a church that talked about money all the time, and it was too much conversation about money. And then when churches became more sensitive to the visitor, to the seeker, they stopped talking about money altogether. And what we're seeing now is a nice return to a real balanced approach toward teaching about money that is really healthy. A wise pastor will say to his congregation, listen, I'm your pastor, and we're going to talk about money because money is an important issue. And I want to talk about how it is that you use the money that God has entrusted to you, because I care about your soul and I care about your spiritual growth. And I think that's a great new trend. Andy Stanley, I think, has really nicely captured this, as only Andy Stanley tends to do. He says, we talk about, with our people, we talk not about what we want from them, but what we want for them when it comes to generosity. We talk about money not because of what we want from you, but because of what we want for you. And what Andy wants, and other churches that we're working with want, is they want people to understand that generosity is a part of their spiritual journey and it's a part of Christ-likeness. Another trend that we're seeing is that generous churches are really trying to model generosity to their congregation in very compelling and real ways. And I'll give you a couple of illustrations of that. One is Cross Timbers Church in Texas decided that they were going to give away their entire Easter offering a couple of years ago. And they had no idea how much would come in. They had no idea whether someone would drop a gigantic check in the offering plate that weekend and they would give it away. But that experience of making the decision to give away that entire offering inspired their congregation, and they saw what was the largest offering that they'd seen all year, and they gave away that Sunday $240,000 to ministries outside of the four walls of Cross Timbers. Another great church in Chicago, Community Christian Church in Naperville, has done a great job with this as well. In fact, they've sort of taken it to the next level because the guys at Community Christian have decided that they're going to budget their ministry on 51 weeks a year, not 52. So every year they give one complete offering away, and their people have been inspired by that. A third trend that we're seeing, and this is kind of a cool one, I guess the way of saying it is that generosity is becoming like the new evangelism. And what we're seeing is that churches that are really promoting and advancing and talking about this idea of generosity and giving are finding that the people in their church are using this as a way to invite their neighbors to come to church or to come to experience what's happening. It might sound something like this. Listen, you got to come to church with us this weekend because our church is going to give away all of this money to some fantastic organizations here in the city. And I'd like you to see that. So that neighbor that might not come to church thinking they were afraid of what it might be about, or I don't want to hear that kind of a message, is inspired to come because that generosity is magnetic. And so the wise Christian in those churches is able to use that experience to invite their neighbors to Christ, and it's opening up tremendous opportunities for the gospel. One of the questions that we think is worth answering in this whole topic of generosity and giving is that is there a difference between the way men and women need to be talked to about giving? Meaning, is there a way that men and women process generosity and stewardship in the church differently? We think the answer to that is yes. It's been pretty traditionally a kind of a man's topic. Giving decisions might be made sort of in a man-to-man kind of conversation. And men generally, and this is really just a generalization, but men are generally looking for a return on investment. So a presentation or an ask given to a man might highlight what the return on investment is. If you give this much money, these are the results that might take place in terms of metrics. But what we're finding is that in many cases, women who control often the giving decisions of a family, some significant number of checks that are given. Somebody told me once, and I'm not sure that this is exactly right, but somebody told me more than 70% of all checks written to churches are written by women. So now you have to ask yourself, what is it that might inspire a woman to give? Is it ROI or is it something else? And what we're finding is that often it's not so much the return on investment, but it's the transformation story. It's the story of life changed that causes a woman's heart to be more engaged. So, all that to say that as you're talking to people in your church about giving, remember that some will be inspired by a return on investment. Some might be more inspired by a transformation story, and those differences actually may break down across gender lines. We have some predictions too. We think that the future of generosity is really, really bright here in America. And I think one of the predictions that we would articulate is that truly the best is yet to come as it relates to giving and stewardship. We think that more and more churches are beginning to understand what it means to not just, preach the sermon on the amount when you need people in your church to give, but instead to build this concept of generosity and stewardship and giving into the spiritual formation path that you lay out for your people, and that as you do that, not only will they really grow in their faith, but that growth will be evidenced by the way they give to your church and to other ministries that are doing some great work in the kingdom. So I guess I would say that in closing, we're very, very encouraged by what we're seeing happening in churches that are embracing this idea of creating a culture of generosity and stewardship. There have been a number of different models that have emerged of how to do that, a number of different really great ideas. In fact, over the past several years, we've been observing what those great ideas and those models are. And my good friend Jim Shepard, who is the principal of Generis, and I are writing a book called Contagious Generosity, which we think is going to unpack what it takes to create a culture of giving in your church. That book is going to be coming out in the Leadership Network Innovation Series published by Zondervan in April of 2012. So look for that book, because we think it will really tell the story of the way churches are creating a culture of generosity. If you'd like to contact me, you can reach me at Leadership Network via email. Just send me an email to chris.willard@leadnet.org, and I'd be happy to stay in touch with you and keep this dialogue going. Thanks for taking a few minutes to learn about what's happening in churches related to generosity and giving.